some new ones in the start of 2021, hopefully a better year. But we've got a nice difference this evening. In our previous chats, we've had a range of different people from different coaches at different levels from around the world, and ex-performers as well. But tonight we've got 3 members of staff from Cardiff Met University, so where I work, who are going to be looking at a fantastic topic, which is a nice topic which doesn't matter which level or potentially what sport you're in, or different sort of sectors. Mentoring is a key aspect, and today we've got 3 fantastic individuals. We've got Andy Lane, Charlie Corsby, and Dan Spencer, who are going to be talking us through a case study in and around the topic of mentoring. What we're going to do in today's session is going to be slightly different. It will be more of a chalk and talk. So these guys they've got a presentation they're going to work their way through, of which via the powers of Zoom, I'm going to attempt to manage it this end. So whilst you're listening in, take some notes. Feel free to put questions in the chat box on the side. And what the structure will be is that they're going to present in a different order. Each of them are going to present, and then we'll have some Q&A at the close. So you have a chance to chuck some questions at these guys in relation to maybe what they did or anything in and around mentoring. So that's going to be the format for today's session. So without further ado, I'll let these guys introduce themselves and we'll make a start. So team, when you're ready.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mark. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your time today. Yeah, this is really cool. I think the fact that we're able to kind of embrace technology and get coaches in the room and discuss the work that we've been doing is great for us. You know, it's a project that's quite close to our hearts. It's what we've been working on for the last couple of months. So it's, this is something that we're quite passionate about, and hopefully that comes across in the presentation today. Just by way of introduction, I'll start. My name is Charlie Corsby. I'm one of the lecturing staff at Cardiff Met within the sports coaching team. So by day, lecturer, and then by night, a very average footballer who coaches and plays. So I've been through my coaching licenses, currently an A licensed coach, and I work at Cardiff Met Academy Football Club, Cardiff Met Football Club Academy, where we have a range of coaches and players from all the way from under 5s all the way to 19s, which is attached to the men's first team as well. So lots and lots of coaching practice in terms of on the grass, and then understanding the structures as well, which is kind of what we're going to be speaking about today in terms of where coach education, coach development, coach learning, where that can fit into the wider picture. Before I go on to the actual presentation itself, I'll pass you over to Andy and Dan just to introduce themselves so you know who's going to speak as we jump throughout the presentation.
Thanks, Charlie. So yeah, my name's Andrew Lane. I'm also a member of staff at Cardiff Met. My main sport is triathlon. I coach within that. Right now there's a triathlon happening over in Daytona in Florida. So I'm looking forward to kind of getting back to that afterwards, because one of the guys I work with is racing at the moment. A little bit of background in football as well, in terms of sort of mentoring experience, having been a mentee on a couple of different governing body programs, UK coaching, some sort of general sport Wales, as well as specific work within triathlon, and similarly sort of from a mentoring perspective. So the 3 of us, and I'll let Dan introduce himself in a moment, have got a good grasp of what it looks like in terms of coaching practice, mentoring experience, and then also kind of the academic insight that will provide a little bit of a mixture of today.
Okay, yeah, my name's Dan Spencer. I'm a bit in my early stage of my career as an academic. I've just recently attained a contract doing that at Cardiff Met, as Mark mentioned previously. I'm also just finishing off my PhD work, which is based around sport coaching and looking at how coaches use language. And also just been doing this project with Andy and Charlie, which has been a great opportunity for me alongside my research and alongside my work in and around mentoring as well. Coaching perspective, very similar to Charlie in that respect. Not quite far as along in my coaching badges. I'm at a UEFA B standard currently, and also have worked in and around the academy, and then also in particular with the reserve team at Cardiff Met as well.
Okay, cool. So we'll get started straight away. So I think probably the way that we can position this from the start is our aim of this presentation today is very much around generating discussion around mentoring. We want to provide a critical insight. And the way that we're going to provide that critical insight is actually by providing a case study of some of the work that we do at Cardiff Met across some of the modules. We're going to go into a little bit more detail later in terms of exactly what that looks like. But the way that we see this is really fitting in within the wider coach development landscape, and particularly asking some questions in terms of, or some wider questions in terms of, where can higher education fit in within coach development more generally, and looking at some specific details in terms of how mentoring can be used as a way forward of better connecting what coaches do in their practice. So in terms of the title, as you can see, it's Becoming a Mentor, a case study of student coaches' experience of mentoring. Very much like this presentation today, those student coaches had a complete range of experiences, and they worked in a complete range of sports. So whilst I'm going to speak quite generally about learning and development, obviously some of the points that we're going to raise are really for you to think about how that can link to your practice, your particular context, and your learning experiences as well. So Mark, can I ask you to move on? Brilliant. Okay, so in terms of structure, the way that this presentation is going to run, firstly, we're going to provide a brief overview of the landscape of mentoring as we see it. Now, I've highlighted we there because it's really important that we recognize the position from which we are doing this presentation, i.e. that we're working in HE, we're working with neophyte coaches, some of which are on the earlier parts of their journey. This was a formal mentoring program as well, in terms of it was structured, there was an assessment attached to it. It was research informed in the sense that we presented the research around mentoring to frame this particular project. And also we really advocate that the coaches try to apply theory to practice. So this wasn't just kind of an arbitrary mentoring program. This was very much specific. It had learning objectives attached to it. And that's really what we're going to try and explore today. Again, that's really important, which I'm going to speak about a little bit later in terms of framing the context of mentoring. In that regard, we're going to present a case study of student coaches mentoring within the HE setting, so where we currently work and teach. And the follow-up messages are going to be around how we can start to think and ask critical questions around mentoring practice. So we're going to hopefully provide some key messages for you to reflect on if you're in a mentoring position, or if you're in a learning position, or as you're working through as a mentee. Perfect, thanks Mark. So we've got some kind of questions that I'm going to leave you at the start. So these are some questions you might want to ask yourself, and hopefully as we go through this presentation, it's going to be clear why I'm asking some of these questions. So the first one is, who's responsible for mentoring? Which is really a crucial question from the outset that we must engage with. There's also, how can shared experiences inform mentoring? Hopefully you can kind of see where I'm edging towards there. What is meaningful within mentoring relationships? What hooks will you draw upon, whether that's a mentee or a mentor? And what assumptions are we making about learning? Again, a crucial question, because this is really directed towards learning and development of coaches. So in terms of that landscape, I'm going to pass you over to Andy, who's going to give you a bit of an overview. So off you go, Andy.
Thanks, Mark. Can you just change slides for me, Mark? Brilliant. Okay, so just in terms of background and context, what I want to do is just provide you a short overview. Oh, let's go back if we can, Mark. I'll leave you to fiddle with that. Just a bit of a short overview, really, of the research base in terms of where are we with mentoring, what do we know about mentoring, and then I'll go into a little bit of a kind of a critical background around it as well, to kind of help position the rationale for our work. So I'm sure many of you have your own experiences as mentees and mentors, and likewise, we've got similar sort of experiences here. So from an anecdotal point of view, I'm sure that a lot of you have really engaged in that already and kind of seen and heard and understood some of the benefits around mentoring and why it's been used in practice. One of the key things that the research base has highlighted, and Jenny, well, in particular over the last 5 years, really where the research has kind of picked up a little bit more, is around the bridging between theory to practice. So coaches can really take what they've understood within the classroom, perhaps something they've read, or maybe sort of in their own time, work with a mentor, and then understand that and explore that within practice. So really being able to shift the site of learning from more of a classroom base to actually then in their own context, and can understand the kind of theory and the background information in relation then to what they're doing, the people they're working with, some of the challenges that they face within their own context. Overall, and sort of within Adam's and Al's work, has really kind of shown that through a number of youth coach education programs, that mentoring is being positioned as a really useful tool to support formal and informal learning of coaches. It's quite important to understand that a lot of the research that we'll go through just sort of in this opening couple of slides is based upon work that's been done within national governing bodies. So actually it's been undertaken within the field that most of you and we're sort of based in as well. It's not just theoretical in terms of the research that it's producing. Although the mentoring is being positioned as something that's really useful and beneficial to coaches, one of the key things that we really need to start doing is problematize it a little bit more, be a little bit more critical to really start to understand some of the complexities that exist within mentoring practice and between both mentees and mentors. Mark, can you just shift it on one slide, please? It will come up, I'm sure. Okay, so I'm sure the text will load in a second. So in terms of being more critical about mentoring practice, one of the main areas that the research is really focused on is or has kind of emerged within the research that's looked at as well, the power dynamics that are inherent within the coach education settings that exist between the organizations as well as those individuals. So by power, what we're really talking about here is the influence that an individual or perhaps an organization such as a national governing body can have on someone else. So in the context of our work in today's presentation, it's the influence that a mentor might have on a mentee, or perhaps a national organization, their structures, a mentoring program can have upon the mentees themselves as well. Generally, over the last 5 years, I mentioned, a lot of this work has kind of really shifted to exploring mentoring practice within national governing bodies. And a number of colleagues, such as Rebecca Sawick et al. And Leader and Cushion, have really found that mentoring is being used as a form of social control. So by that, what we mean is that the national governing bodies or the mentors can actually almost be gatekeepers to provide mentee coaches with a way that they should be coaching. So they hold the values, the beliefs, the knowledge around what good coaching is and what good coaching should look like. So in some respects, this is really useful because then a mentor can work with a mentee and start to shape them how they want to. And that can be really helpful because it might be shifting their practice forwards. But on the other hand, this is a little bit more problematic because actually the assumptions around what good practice is, what good coaching is, often go unchecked and unchallenged. And I'm sure many of you can already start to think of and might look in the media for some of these issues which are inherent within our sport. One of the big things here is that really kind of the focus for mentoring practice, where it's about learning and helping an individual shift, can't really happen if there's almost a preconceived idea of what mentoring should look like and what coaching should look like. Similarly, one of the reasons for this might be the fact that coaches or mentors don't have much training. Now, there are a number of organizations which are running really productive mentoring programs. I certainly know within triathlon, I'm not sure what it's like within gymnastics and trampolining, but certainly within a number of NGBs, they do receive some training. But just as mentoring practice can be a form of social control for the mentees, the training that the mentors can get can also act as a form of social control. So unless they're being kind of guided towards how to learn, how to develop, how to engage within their mentoring practice, it's kind of going to be sort of cyclical in nature. So one of the real problems here is that we need to probably train and have a better understanding of what mentoring practice is. So Mark, can you just shift on one more slide, please? And then that'll be it for me. So this is kind of where we're arriving at, that the research has shown with a number of national governing bodies that mentoring practice is really constrained by this social control and the influence and power that the programs, the national governing bodies, or perhaps the mentors have on the mentees. So the way in which we see it then is really around mentoring as being such as a learning endeavor, where the focus of the work is really shifting the practice of the coaches. Mark's just pressing buttons here. And we really want to kind of change the way they think, change the way they behave, change the way they work, but not just about how the mentors see it or the national governing bodies see it. What we really want to focus on is that individual themselves and helping them understand why they're doing what they're doing, not helping them act in a certain way that we, perhaps as national governing body or the mentors, think they should do. So really what we want to do is encourage mentees to take greater responsibility for their actions and inevitably then their consequences. And part of that role really is the mentor should act as a more knowledgeable other. So by that, we're meaning that they should have more understanding of the practice. They should perhaps have better facilitation skills, questioning, being really critical of what the coaches do within their practice. To do that, they need to add a level of security to make sure that the learner understands what has been asked of them, that they're kind of comfortable within who they are as a mentee, but also then their learning. But at the same time, take them to kind of the edge of chaos and really challenge their learning where they should feel uncomfortable, that it shouldn't feel that easy, and can really kind of make a difference within them. So they're constantly wrestling with, I'm not sure if this is quite right. I think I know this, and then they're kind of developing their knowledge and understanding. And because of that, over time, they should become more secure in that knowledge. They should really learn and understand that in more detail. So then they kind of change from that uncertainty to knowing actually what's going on here. But then the role of the mentor is to challenge them again, give them something new to think around, trying to shift their practice forward again, check their values and beliefs, for example. So really, the mentoring practice is in this kind of constant state of flux. So it's not a static endeavor. It's really kind of shifting and moving all the time. But the job of a mentor is not to be redundant, where we just try and empower the mentee. It's really to always be that more knowledgeable, more capable other, where we're challenging their learning. So that's kind of how we see mentoring, the role of the mentor going into this study. And I'll pass over now to Charlie, who will take us on to the next little part.
I'll actually take the reins from here, if that's all right, Andy.
Sorry, Dan.
You just move the next slide, please, Mark. Okay, great. So this sort of brings us on to the actual research and the study part itself, as Andy just explained. And just to sort of summarize some of the points that Andy's made so far, a lot of the research in and around mentoring has looked at it from a wider sort of institutional national governing body perspective. But there's really been little around some of the more nitty gritty everyday realities of what it means to be a mentor or even a mentee, and also really to be part of that mentoring relationship. And so the aim of our project and of our research then was to examine some of these developmental experiences of mentors and also mentees whilst participating in our mentoring program, which I'll come on to explain in a minute. And so in this sense, we wanted to really have a look at some of those critical experiences of what it means to be a mentor and what it means to be a mentee. And all really to sort of understand how they can operationalize their roles and how they can construct that mentoring relationship. And so as part of our undergraduate degree, Andy and Charlie developed our mentoring program. And so third year coaching students studying in and around a module on mentoring actually were paired with some of our first year sport coaching students who are of course just starting in their coaching careers and also in starting their studies in their first years. And so they were developing this mentoring relationship throughout the first term of their degree. Sorry, next slide, please, Mark. There we are. Okay, so how this really sort of unfolded and how this really looked in terms of the mentoring practice is mentors or the third years were required to facilitate some of these mentoring relationships and organize some meetings with their first year students. And so these first years who were practicing and coaching weekly with school children in what we called our work placements, following the delivery and following their coaching sessions, the third years or mentors in this case would sit down and perhaps take observations and also reflect and review on some of that coaching practice and some of the critical experiences that unfolded. In some cases, which was great to see, some of the third years the mentors and mentees also arranged meetings external to those particular coaching placements, whether that be over a coffee in a cafe, for example, to further deconstruct and review and reflect on some of those initial coaching experiences that those first years were going through. Now, the mentoring placement and the mentoring program, and also, of course, the modules that were running alongside them took place over the 12 weeks of the first term of the year. And so the direction and the focus of that mentoring program, that relationship, was directed toward guiding the first years, their new experience of becoming coaches, in order to develop their practice, for them to really understand what it means to be a coach and how they can understand to coach in that particular setting. But it was also geared towards arriving at assessments at the end of that 12 weeks. The first years here were being assessed on their practical ability, i.e. of how to coach, but also on their ability to use some of the coaching theories and styles that we had gone through in the module itself, or in the first year module at that time. And so this was kind of reflective of what we thought of a traditional NGB program, whereby a particular novice coach or a trainee coach is working towards that final assessment, whether that be as part of one of their levels of their coaching badges. So without trying to bore you too much, I'll just quickly go through some of the more technical aspects of the research itself. So in order to collect our data, or the information that we needed for the project, it was actually me this time, arranged a series of group interviews. And I say interviews, they were more so of an informal chat with 4 or 5 either mentors and mentees, to really chat about some of their experiences they went through the mentoring program, to understand exactly what it was like to be part, either a mentor or a mentee, and also to be part of that relationship as it sort of unfolded. In order to gain a sort of temporal and time aspect throughout the data, we conducted these interviews at different time points. So first of all, there was one conducted just over halfway, around 7 weeks. Another then at the end of the module, or the end of the mentoring program at the 12 weeks, and once the assessments are finished. And then again 2 or 3 weeks later, once the dust has settled slightly and they were able to really make sense of some of the events and some of those critical experiences that happened. So once all these interviews were completed and we gathered some of that information that we needed, Charlie, Andy and I sat down about once every other week for a couple of months in order to start to analyze and really make sense of some of the responses that the mentors and mentees had given, and then eventually come to a conclusion or come to arrive at some form of results, which I'll now hand over to Charlie, who's going to explain these in a bit more detail.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dan. Mark, if I can just move on a slide, please. Okay, brilliant. So what we're going to present today is part of a much wider data set. But the 3 themes that I'm going to present today relate to initiating meaningful mentoring, becoming in mentoring, and finally putting mentoring to work. What's really crucial is that these 3 themes, whilst I've kind of presented them as discrete, they are in fact interrelated, and that should become quite clear as I go through some of the data and highlight how mentoring was done. What is also really important is what we were trying to capture is what Dan described as the gritty reality of what was going on within those within the mentoring practice and within the experiences of the mentors and the mentees. And so what I'm going to explain, whilst I'm going to try and make it clear for you, it's not to be seen as clean and neat. And actually there was a real range of experiences across both mentors and mentees. And that was something that we feel is reflective of a wider mentoring structures, and that's really something that we were trying to understand throughout. And so in that regard, the findings really demonstrated the ability, or as the case may be, the inability of the learners, and when I say learners, I mean both mentors and mentees, to develop any sort of awareness. We've described it as a reflexive awareness, so a critical self-analysis of what is required to negotiate and align their pedagogic practices in relation to the modules that they were undertaking, in relation to their coaching practice, and in relation to the actual context in which they were working. So I'm going to work through each of those themes, and hopefully some of the data will bring to life really what I'm trying to explain here. So Mark, if I can just move on to the first theme. Brilliant. So the first part that I want to talk to you about is around initiating meaningful mentoring. Now, as we kind of alluded to in terms of the landscape of mentoring, mentoring is an ill-defined activity. It's generally seen, it's generally accepted as something that is good. We kind of all accept that mentoring is good, and particularly when we use it in lay language. I'm sure as you're sat here now, you can kind of think of someone who's mentored you. It's quite a nice descriptive word. But when we try to move that into an educational setting, mentoring occupies quite a precarious position. It's quite unstable. It's quite unclear often what mentors are actually there to do, and therefore what mentees are subsequently there to do. kind of know it's about learning, we kind of know it's about development, but in terms of how that actually gets going is often quite unclear. And that was really, really reflective in terms of the data that we found from this particular study. And I think that's really reflective in terms of this first quote from James, who's a mentor, when he states, "I didn't know anything about it." He was talking about mentoring him. "I knew what mentoring was as a thing, as an idea, but I didn't have an opinion on it. I'd never really experienced it." And so this was, again, really reflective of the ill-defined nature of mentoring, that we kind of know what we mean when we talk about mentoring, but actually we're not really sure either. Can't really put our finger directly on it, which means that in terms of initiating mentoring, it's really difficult, or the mentors and the mentees found it really difficult to get mentoring going, to actually do mentoring practice. And so in that regard, we've got this kind of really key concept that we constructed from the data in relation to the status meeting. So this status meeting in relation to initiating meaningful mentoring was really, really important. And when I say about a status meeting, I mean an initial assessment and application of the mentoring arrangement. So recognizing who it is that is doing the mentoring. So who is the mentor, who is the mentee? And that really, really asks some quite vulnerable questions as well in terms of exposing some of this information. And again, that was reflective for Alice, a mentee, when she described mentoring as a strong word. It shouldn't just be thrown out there. And so for Alice, actually just being assigned a mentor, despite recognizing that it could be something potentially fruitful, something that could potentially be good for her development, was actually kind of really rejecting some of these ideas. It was quite skeptical in terms of this idea of, well, mentors are generally a good thing. That actually, no, we have to be quite critical about this. And that was really reflective in Alice's opinion and her experiences in relation to being a mentee. So in that regard, initiating meaningful mentoring was crucial. And so I've got another quote on the next slide. So Mark, if I can just move you on to that one. So here, another quote that really reflects what were they there to do? And so in that regard, one of the mentors described the process, said, "I think the process was slowed down by that first meeting. So I came out worried and I put it to them. Not put them off, but gave them the impression that he doesn't know what he's doing. It was clear you don't only have one type of mentor." Again, this kind of unpicks and critically questions some of the ideas within mentoring, that we can kind of be this person who can educate others. We have different types of mentors. And actually what the mentor is describing here, that their experience immediately was one of being quite vulnerable, one of being quite exposed in terms of their educational practices. They assumed this role that wasn't really that clear. They weren't there to be another lecturer or to be another tutor, to be another coach educator. But they weren't there just to be a colleague, another coach. They occupied this quite strange and unclear position in which they had to put some firm boundaries on, put some clarity on. Again, that really relates to this idea of initiating mentoring practice as being quite problematic, but being something that is a part of the process as well. And that really speaks to this idea of how were the mentors and the mentees able to get mentoring done, and initiating mentoring was really clear here. So that really links to this next point. So Mark, if I move you on to the next theme. So this idea in terms of moving forward from initiating mentoring was a fascinating one for us. And the data was really clear in this regard in terms of the struggles that the mentors and the mentees had in terms of becoming within this particular relationship. And so I'm going to talk about becoming as being something that was really essential in this particular context, but it was also something that was really interesting. So building upon the previous idea of not really being sure in terms of how to get mentoring going, the mentors were indeed finding out how to be a mentor. So the actual learning that was going on in this particular context was not necessarily asking questions like, what is good mentoring? What works? How can I influence practice? Was actually really, really difficult questions in terms of who do I need to be in order to gain influence in this particular relationship? And so they were therefore required to search for and enact an appropriate characterization of the role. They had to find a space within the existing context and within their existing relationships that was going to be meaningful. And that was the same for the mentees as well. So likewise, the mentees were also required to find an agreeable space, an agreeable role that would allow them to engage in this particular relationship. So what the mentors were actually doing a lot of the time were trying to get the mentees into a position that they would act like mentees. And likewise, there were some examples that the mentees were requiring the mentors to act in a certain way so that they would be able to engage with them. And as you can imagine, some mentors took this role much different from others, and they found it much harder to conceptualize. And so this idea of the mentor acting in relation to the mentee was really, really interesting in terms of how they were trying to shift to find a position that they could then be in an agreeable relationship so they could have an influence over each other's practices, have an influence over each other's learning and development. In that regard, the mentoring was relational. It was relational to the mentors and the mentees being able to do mentoring together, to do it with each other, rather than just on each other, just on coaches. And so by way of an example, if I move you to the next slide. So Henry provides a really nice example here in terms of the difficulties he had responding to the mentees. So Henry had these really idealistic, really utopian, really clear ideas in terms of what he wanted to get across to his mentees. But actually, when he started to be questioned by Dan, he explained, I wanted to start talking about different theories. I'd be like, right, I'm going to start having a good conversation about coaching, a meaningful conversation perhaps. But then every week I'd just respond to what I'd seen in their practice. So it was really this kind of causal relationship. I could just do what I'd act upon what I'd seen. There was no wider conceptualization. There was no wider discussions around theory, that actually what he needed to do or what he felt like he was bound to doing was just reacting to what the mentee was doing. And likewise, another example of this came from around becoming a coach or a mentee. So he then went on to explain, every time I observed my mentee, she took the assistant coach role essentially. I said, look, try to take the lead, try to take some responsibility, maybe introduce the session and get a bit more hands-on. It was an important step. So whilst originally having these really clear ideas in terms of how mentoring fits in within the wider coach development, coach learning landscape, i.e. having an influence over practice, developing good ideas of good practice, developing with each other, actually a lot of the work that was going on within this mentoring relationship was actually finding out where the mentees could try and have influence. And a lot of the time it was actually just trying to move the mentee coaches to act like coaches, to be like coaches. And so in this particular example at the bottom, it was trying to actually get them to do what might look like good coaching. And it was trying to move them into this really functional relationship in a place that they could then engage with coaching practice, which is really quite limiting in terms of how mentoring was enacted within this particular study, and how mentoring was enacted by the actors that were involved. Which leads me on to the final theme. So if I can move on one more, Mark. Brilliant. So some of the key things in this final one was around putting mentoring to work. And so this is really crucial in terms of if the original status meeting, so arriving at an agreeable place, and the actual application of mentoring was clunky, wasn't smooth, weren't able to arrive at a clear relationship, and the mentor wasn't able to become someone who could have an influence over the mentee, or the mentee wasn't able to shift into a position where they were workable, where they were agreeable with the mentor, then any ideas of actually having an influence on learning and development was stopped, was frozen. There was no room for the mentees or the mentors to move in this regard. That actually all they were learning is, right, these are the particular roles that are required within this particular relationship. But there were some examples in terms of how mentors were able to put it to work, what they were able to actually work on. And a really crucial idea here then was around how the mentoring was with rather than on the mentees. So the mentors had to work with them. So actually that often required the mentors to take responsibility of their own learning and their own development before it actually required the mentees to engage with anything they were saying. So they really had to ask some questions of themselves, that critical reflexive engagement that I spoke about earlier, rather than thinking about really clear idealistic ideas in terms of what they wanted to cover. And again, a really crucial idea here then, that the mentors were really trying to hook their practice into, really trying to, what they're really dependable on in terms of trying to have an influence, was this idea of hooking into a meaningful relationship. And so they were trying to find these really functional ways that they could have an influence over mentoring practice. And so the following quote really kind of captures this in terms of one of the mentors explained. I was helping based more upon practical stuff like positioning, organization, like koans, bib, structured sessions, utilizing the space and stuff, how they speak, where they speak, are they organized as a group, all the things they don't necessarily think of, but make that session a little bit more effective and smooth. And I think that those two kind of last descriptive words there, effective and smooth, are really interesting there. They wanted something that was functional. They wanted to engage in what works. And that was really the clear hooking into a meaningful relationship, or that's what the mentors deemed as being hooking into a meaningful relationship. But actually, when we start to critically question some of these ideas, we're not really getting into the complexity of coaching practice. We weren't really getting into the gritty realities of what the coaches were facing or what they're likely to face when they go into the wider world of coaching. And so there was something slightly detached in terms of these ideas of putting mentoring to work, particularly in relation to how they were able to be or not be within their particular relationship. The ability to have an influence or the inability to have an influence was really crucial, and that really chimed out from the data. So in terms of some key messages then, so Mark, if I can move you on to the next slide. So some key messages, what are we really trying to say here? If I can try and summarize that. The mentoring within this particular context, and we feel that has some kind of wider transferability to other contexts, really relates to mentoring being dynamic. It's negotiated. It's not, whilst often positioned as being hierarchical, so a mentor more experienced than a mentee, what the data really showed us is that it was much more shifting, is much more movement, much more agreement required, which was found in those status meeting, initiating mentoring, that's perhaps less clear within explanations in research and explanations found within governing bodies. We often have quite clear guidance for mentors, but what we actually find in reality is that mentors and mentees are required to continually shift towards becoming someone who can have an influence over others within this particular relationship. And that therefore necessitates that they need to ask themselves really critical questions in terms of what they think good coaching is, what underpins that complex nature of coaching as we see it. Others may not agree, but really in terms of what we feel are the crucial parts around what coaching practice is. And so in that regard, mentoring is then underpinned by the complex nature of good coaching. And getting mentors and mentees and those responsible for designing educational workshops and learning environments, learning objectives, they really need to ask some really crucial questions in terms of what are some of those assumptions around good coaching, so that we can then shape and understand what the subsequent experiences of mentors and mentees might look like. And so for Andy, Dan and I, we have a couple of questions that we feel like could support and develop those who enter into those relationships. So Mark, if I can move you on to the next slide. Yeah, pop them all up. So we really have these kind of questions. One of the things that we've kind of advocated off the back of this and how we've tried to implement this within the latest iteration of the module and the mentoring program is to really try to force the mentors to ask themselves some really crucial questions in terms of their assumptions around their positions that they hold, what experiences they have, what they think good mentoring is going to look like, what they think good coaching practices, and how they're going to work towards that. Questions like, who is the mentee to me and who am I to them? What assumptions do I have about the mentee's needs? What do they need to be so that we can engage in meaningful practice? And what is going to influence the unfolding mentoring coaching practice? And in asking some of those questions, we'd also advocate that the mentees need to ask the same questions, or the mentors need to ask the same questions of the mentees, such as, who is the mentor to me? Who am I to the mentor? What insecurities do I have about my coaching practice? And how can this person help with my learning and development as a coach? All of which are really targeted at kind of addressing this ill-defined, this unclear, precarious nature of mentoring, and try and firm up some ground in terms of where they sit, and to get some kind of agreement between mentor and mentees so that they can have an influence on each other's practice, and they can work towards addressing some of the details of that complex, everyday, dynamic, multifaceted coaching practice that they're going to experience, irrespective of the context, irrespective of the sport and sport-specific knowledge. And that was really kind of our key focus there. So I feel like I've given a really kind of whistle-stop tour in terms of some of the data that we've got. There's lots that I could kind of go into and supplement on that, but we promised Mark that we'd be finished by Q2, and from my watch we're bang on the money. So I think that gives us good time to actually open up some questions, because I think there's some interesting ideas in here that actually need exploring through questions and discussions, rather than kind of us pitching some clear ideas to the audience as to what we think mentoring is. So Mark, if I can just move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. And I suppose we're open to any questions that you might have.
Awesome, team. Thank you very much for that awesome presentation. Andy, Charlie, and Dan, I think that was beautifully put together, and it sounds like an interesting project with some cool findings as well. Of which I know I've written down some questions. Tom's just going to come out of this screen and bring up the other one, and then we'll chuck out some questions.
Sorry. So I'll take some questions and I will work out the screen. Sorry, guys.
Right, cool. First question from me would be, well, firstly, yeah, again, thank you very much for that presentation. Some good detailed comments there around those three separate themes. So I just want to have a little comment about the first initial meeting. What, like you said, that's an important integral part of the process. Just wanted because I've been a mentor for some time now. It's just, what are your thoughts in and around the importance of that meeting, and two, what could it be shaped? If you were going to give some advice to some up and coming mentors, what would be the shaping of that initial meeting? What would it consist of, and potentially what would be like the key aspects you wanted that you would suggest would be good for the mentor and the mentee?
Sure, I'll start, and then anything that I miss, Andy and Dan can jump in. I think it's a really good question, Mark, and that's really kind of the assumption that we're trying to address within this work, is that we're not trying to advocate that there's kind of these clear steps that you can take in order to arrive at good mentoring practice. And actually, it's really it's much more dynamic than that, based upon the context, who it is that you're working with, and what it is and where it is that you're working, the context. So what it looks like in higher education is going to look very different to a national governing body, which is going to look really different to some of the mentoring that I do within the academy with coaches, which is going to be much more kind of on a day-to-day basis. And so really trying to get at some of the reflective questions that I posed at the end, in terms of what am I trying to do? Who am I to them? Who are they to me? I think these are really good questions that you can ask in terms of kind of reflective questions for yourself, but also you can share those with the mentee and say, right, let's have a conversation about this. Let's open up, let's be clear, let's be frank in terms of what it is that we're here to do, because you're not just another educator, you're not just another lecturer, you're not just another coach who has more experience. Actually, we've got to try and put some boundaries on what mentoring looks like and what it is. And so that's then really, really crucial in terms of trying to put the boundaries in the first place. What are we here to do? And so that's what I would say the first initial status meeting should be about, is trying to firm up what that is. How you do that, there's a variety of different ways you might do that, and I'm sure there's, like, in your experience, lots of tips and tricks and tasks that you might do, but the underpinning focus should be around the status meeting, which is the assessment and the application of the mentoring practice.
No, fantastic. And I know from my experience that that initial meeting is crucial, and actually getting it right is important. Because I know one comment that you said in there before we dive into Ainsley's question was that if that meeting, and was that consistent? If that meeting, because I think one of your points was, if that meeting wasn't 100%, then I think you used the term clunky after that. If they got that first meeting wrong, then it led to some issues later on. What happened there?
I'll jump in there if that's all right. So based on some of the discussions with both the mentors and mentees, that initial status meeting, that initial interaction that they were having was really critical, and a lot of them often found it actually quite uncomfortable. I think they sort of, as Charlie was saying, assuming to go into these particular positions and assume a role. They were given this status, they were given this sort of sense that I'm a mentor, I'm a teacher now, and that it would just automatically almost click into place. And for a lot of them, when it actually came down to it, perhaps through lack of preparation, through lack of understanding exactly what that would look like, that's when some of those more uncomfortable, perhaps more messy aspects of what was actually happening started to unfold. And I think it was a real splash in the face, really, or a slap in the face of what was to come, and how much they needed to learn and progress from there, really.
No, fantastic. And I can imagine if you get that initial part right, then fantastic. The question before we jump onto Ainsley's question was, I wanted to ask a question in the round. What sort of training should a mentor go through, or what preparation, what tools should we give them? Because one bit that I liked the way you worded it was, I think you chucked down about messiness. But how do you prepare someone for that chaos, that messiness? Because hopefully, in my mind, hopefully I go on a course and I get told, yeah, look for this, this, and this, done, move on. But how do you prepare someone for that? Or what tools do you give them to prepare for that messiness?
Yeah, I think that's a crucial question, Mark. I think if it was an easy one, I think we wouldn't need to be on this Zoom call now, would we? In terms of kind of working through some of these ideas. But I think there is some real structure in terms of what we can give mentors. I think the first and foremost question is to address the ill-defined nature. So why do we even need the mentors in the first place? What's it there for? What the purpose? And then you can ask some kind of more difficult questions that Andy raised in the landscape around, what is the purpose of this mentoring practice? Why do we need it here? So that's kind of a much more kind of structural designing, learning, development, and education as to what it's there for, and not just assume that this is a good thing. And then once you've kind of still decided that it is a good thing, that you can then go on to ask again some of the reflective questions that we've gone through now, in terms of encouraging the mentors to ask themselves questions as to who they are to the mentee, who the mentee is to them, but really position their role as a more knowledgeable other, that they're there to educate. So they have a responsibility to educate. And so you have to then work through some of these kind of learning principles in terms of what it is that they're going to do. So that would then be kind of a task and a part that I would put into it. And another thing for me that really comes out of this data set as a whole, rather than kind of a distinct theme, is that the mentors, so those responsible for the mentoring practice, they have a responsibility to be on top of their own learning in order to then have an influence on the learners. This is not just something that you get by default because of experience, that actually there was a responsibility for the mentors to continually move their own practice so that they could then move the mentees' practice. And that was the dynamic nature. And again, that kind of speaks back to what Andy was saying about this is not a static idea. This is not, it fits somewhere in between kind of a formal structured element of education, but then it's also very quite informal. It's very much organic in that regard. And so it's kind of really trying to position that in the wider landscape of that coach development education. And I'm not sure if there's anything else you'd want to add into that.
The only thing I'd probably pick up on that is around adding to it in the terms of the mentees. I think they need educating around what their role is within it, and they need to understand that. And I know some NGBs already do that, but a lot of the research that has been conducted within other national government bodies hasn't found that. And certainly from our work, there seem to be a lot of questions that the mentees are trying to understand and challenges they're facing, problems that they're coming across within the mentoring practice, if they'd actually had better education themselves. And I think Ainsley's question there is actually something that you'd probably frame to the mentors and mentees within their initial discussions. It's like, what is the role? Why are you here? What do you want from this? Who are you? How are you going to work with others, for example? Just like the reflexive questions that Charlie put up towards the end.
And I agree. We've got a couple of the British gymnastics coach educators in the room here, and it's an interesting process. I think, obviously, from my experience, it seems like mentoring it's a tag on, and it's stop me if I'm wrong, Tony, but it's almost like we weren't able to cover that. Your mentor will cover that, and then it's sort of just putting that responsibility potentially on someone else who might not have had any training. And you're expecting them to do a good job. And usually the mentoring just happens by default based on, locality, not on the best fit for that person. But in my mind, I think it's quite we don't really prepare people for that. And maybe that's as a comment, like moving forward, is actually, if we're delivering courses, maybe there is a little bit of time where we don't have that much time on courses, but where we unpick what the role of being a mentee is. Because when you say about a more knowledgeable other of the mentor, great, but what is the responsibility of the mentee within this journey as well? Tony, did you want to add anything there? Tony, you can't hear you.
He's not muted.
Oh no. Tony, shout. Say hi very loud. All right, you're not working, Tony.
Yeah.
Write it in the chat, Tony. Write it in the chat. Tony is one of our super tutors of all time. But yeah, no, yeah. So it's that interesting bit of actually, maybe parts on courses need to be devoted to actually unpicking what their role is within that process. But if we pick up on Ainsley's question,
just to add on one thing to that, I think kind of stepping aside, I appreciate this around mentoring. I think we face a challenge sometimes as coaches and athletes themselves. I think athletes aren't really taught about what being coached is. So quite often people talk about coachable athletes, some challenges that go on within a coach and athlete relationship. And actually, they don't really know what this is and how to work with people. So again, we can think around how we might be able to transfer some of the things that we're taking or talking about today within any sort of relationship and how you work with someone else.
No, agree. And I think that's another discussion for another day, of which, if we go on to, what are your thoughts on Ainsley's question? That's a great question from Ainsley, just in the chat there, in terms of who is so is it a joint venture, or should it be more from the mentor or more from the mentee? In my mind, maybe it depends on the level of it. If it's a level 1 mentee, you might say, actually, well, as a mentor, I'll take a bit more steer, and then as they move up for the ranks, it changes. But what were your thoughts on Ainsley's question there? Can you see Ainsley's question?
Yeah, I'll go. And again, Dan, Andy, feel free to jump in anything that I missed. I'm sure I will. I always find this question quite fascinating in terms of whether you say learner-centered or coach-centered. Because in my mind, it's always in relation to each other. Any kind of learning activity, you can't coach without an athlete, and an athlete isn't an athlete by default if there isn't a coach. And so they're always in relation to each other. And I very much see the same in terms of any kind of learning relationship, and then therefore that kind of by default applies to a mentoring relationship. So that final question is the crucial one there in terms of shared responsibility. And that's the crucial bit that goes missing for me in a lot of the mentoring ideas. We have them in Cardiff Met as an organization where we have these ideas: get a mentor and help develop your career as an academic. And I always find they're quite problematic in terms of the way that that's pitched. And I think we see that quite a lot in organizational development more generally. So then to bring that back into coaching, then it's so important that it's a shared endeavor. These two, 3, 4 individuals who are involved in these relationships have to be invested in it, and they're both going to move in the process. If the mentor enters the relationship without any expectation of moving, then it's not going to be a really meaningful and important experience for those involved. And I think it's the same for the mentee as well. So I would certainly describe it as in a shared endeavor. And I think if you put that responsibility on the mentor, so to go back to Mark's question in terms of how do we prepare them, I think a crucial part of preparing them is that actually you as in mentors generally need to be responsible for your own learning so that you can then have an influence on learning of others. If you're not engendering some of those principles, then it's always going to be kind of static in the way that we're going to end up. We're not going to move in the direction that we're looking for, and that can really kind of embrace some of the meaningful principles of mentoring, the meaningful advantages of it. So yeah, I very much see that last question as being the crucial one in terms of how do we generate a meaningful shared endeavor between mentor and mentee.
No, I agree, and that is a difficult one, because if both parties aren't invested, then how can you both progress and move on? And I like the comment there about actually, if we're gonna, as a mentor, if you're gonna preach, well, you need to be doing X, Y, and Z. You need to be reading. Well, actually, as a mentor, and I say this to other tutors, for us to be better tutors and whatnot, well, actually, we need to be reading. We need to be developing ourselves and leading by example. So it's actually, as you say, engendering those traits that we want to see within our mentees. We've got some other questions popping up down here. We'll go to Esther first, then Dave. So the question from Esther there: what would you say are 3 traits that make up a good mentor?
Yeah, I think I'll go again on this one, because I think it kind of relates to what I've just said. I think the question that I'd kind of pose back to that would be, rather than the key traits of a good mentor, would be of good mentoring, which then kind of links together both mentors and mentees.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be the crucial part. And some of those reflective questions, the key messages that I spoke about earlier in the presentation around mentoring being dynamic, mentoring being a learning endeavor, mentoring involving the shifting of both mentor and mentees, they would be some of the key things that I would be looking for. I think inevitably a good mentor in one context it's very much, I describe it as agnostic. A good mentor in one context with certain individuals may work and may have really good experience, but then move them into another context with different individuals, it's not going to be the same experience. What happens in one context might not transfer to another context. So I'd be hesitant to answer your question directly in terms of good mentor traits, but then definitely I think we can pull out some good traits of mentoring, which then actually requires the mentor and the mentees to ask some difficult questions of themselves.
I like that. Dodge the question there, Charlie. I'm joking.
Just to add on that, I think in dodging the question, Charlie sort of answered it, in the sense that the trait here is that, as Charlie said, that you can't necessarily be the same person for everybody, is that you have to continually look back on yourself to sort of assess whether you are being or acting the correct way for this particular individual. It's not necessarily of what you want to preach or what you want for them to do, but am I being the right sort of person to help this particular individual develop?
So it's almost having that ability to be flexible, and also identifying, because it's not a one size fits all. It's okay, well, I need to be the right person at the right time for that individual and for that context. Awesome. So Esther's flexibility, agree. So David's put a long question: what differs in formal and informal mentoring? Is it just expectations? Should we be pushing for further formalization of mentoring, or is there a value from informal mentoring that is lost when we put the formal setting? That's a meaty worded question, but what do you think, chaps?
Good question, Dave. I think the other one's related to it as well, in terms of not saying you can't have one and not the other, but where's the overlap and where they differ. I guess looking at our data, that's not something that we specifically explore, but obviously we've got a little bit of understanding from the research. Just to kind of position it, I think from some challenges that when you formalize things, sometimes then the program takes quite an assessment focus. And I think from what the research is kind of showing is that when you have a formal mentoring program that's tied in with an assessment, the mentors often just get the coach through the assessment. So they have to complete these various tasks. They have to coach in a certain way, demonstrate 3 times, and then they get their level 1 qualification, for example. So some real challenges with formal mentoring, certainly in terms of then how we've kind of framed it today, because I guess we're really challenging that there might not be one way of working with someone, one way of coaching, and what good coaching looks like. That's not to say that you certainly can't bring them into formal mentoring, but I think there's a difference between coach education, where it's qualification based, coach development, and then also some informal as well. I don't know if you want to pick up from that, Charlie and Dan.
Yeah, I think you've provided a nice insight there. I think Dave, the question you're asking is a really interesting one as well, because if you kind of put them on kind of a continuum in terms of these are certain tasks that you must complete, would be more towards the formal end, and then kind of picking up elements of the everyday realities, the complexity, as being more informal. But you can also have that in terms of the assignment of mentoring. So within the presentation, when I described it as a formal mentoring program, it was the sense that this was built into the content and the structures of that particular learning context. And we were kind of moving away from this informal that you've worked with someone for a long period of time and you have a relationship with them and they are seen as your mentor. I think actually that kind of contributes to some of the sticky ground, the ill-defined nature that that we were trying to kind of, that in many ways we're trying to undo a little bit and try and really position where this can fit in specifically within coach development or coach education programs.
Cool. I think we're coming up to the sort of close here, but I had a couple more questions. One bit here, I think you stole the term, you said edge of chaos. So one thing, like in terms of like the world of mentoring and whatnot, is that there's a lot of challenging conversations that need to take place potentially. And edge of chaos is where the best and fun learning hopefully takes place. How do you prepare someone for those sort of challenging conversations? Because I think it's potentially quite a difficult thing sometimes. Of the mentor has to be able to potentially, if they're the right person for that individual, they've obviously got to try wade through everything, and then identify that key aspect, which could be a challenging conversational point. How do we prepare someone for that, to deal with those challenging conversations?
Mark, I think this comes back to the informal and formal nature. The informality of mentoring, which is often kind of advocated, that misses some of the difficulties that are involved within coaching practice. I think everyone on call has experienced coaching. That's why we're here, and so we kind of know that A doesn't go to B and B doesn't go to C, and so it's dealing with some of these ideas. Which is very much in the nature of what we do as coaches and as educators, and reconceptualizing the role of a coach as an educator, and therefore reconceptualizing the role of a mentor as a more knowledgeable other, as an educator, goes some way to addressing that. Because actually, if it is a shared endeavor and it is working towards learning objectives, learning outcomes, and development of both mentor and mentee, then those difficult conversations are just going to be, they're in the context, they come with the nature of what we're doing as coaches. It is pretty messy, so we kind of need to front up to that, and we need to embrace it. And I think that would be the key point, and actually need to try and engage with some of these conversations, and that's where the real fruitfulness is, which was one of the kind of criticisms from the data in terms of what the mentors ended up doing. Is because they found it difficult, the status meeting maybe didn't go as they would have liked, they weren't really able to become the coaches, and the mentees weren't able to become what they needed to be. They were trying to hook into practice. Right, I'm going to look at where you put your cones down, and I'm going to see where you stand and see how much you say, and maybe you can cut your instruction from 35 seconds to 30 seconds. Really functional things that don't really engage with the difficulties and the complexities of what's actually going on. And that's where we want it to go, and that's where you should kind of be wanting the mentoring to go. And when I say difficult, I don't mean negative connotations either. Difficult in terms of, right, this is going to challenge you and this is going to challenge me, and we're going to share this, which is kind of what we spoke about earlier. And that's just to pick up on Tom's question. I think Tom's question is a brilliant one in terms of the ideal trait, in terms of the ability to be who the mentee needs. It is, but you might need to move the mentee in terms of where they think they need to be in the first place, which is what was going on in the data as well. That actually, in order for some of the mentors to engage in good mentoring practice, that actually what they needed the coach to do is to actually do a bit of coaching in the first place, to really get into the experiences of coaching, so that we can have some interesting conversations around it. So for that particular data extract, I think it was really interesting, because the mentors are trying to get to a point where we're going to deal with some of this messiness of coaching practice. We're going to deal with some of these difficult conversations that we're likely to have. But in order to do that, I might need to move you. So whilst it is kind of being flexible in your own approach and assumptions, it's flexible, but having some clear idea in terms of who you want the other to be as well. So that's the dynamic nature, that's the moving back and forth between mentor and mentee.
Mark,
Gotcha.
you raised a good question. Earlier on, you said about the training, and I think the fact that that question you just asked would feature in training. It's like, how do you have these interactions? How do you take someone to the edge of chaos where they feel insecure, but you need to add an element of security? Certainly from our experiences, but within literature as well, I don't see that featuring in many mentoring programs for the mentees or the mentors. Like, how do you engage in this? What does this look like? How do you feel as a result of this? What work do you have to do to make someone feel secure, but very insecure at the same time? And that's probably things that have probably been neglected from a lot of education that we feel really should feature in here, that Charlie mentioned and kind of we got to in terms of the becoming a mentee and becoming a mentor. That's what we'd really want it to focus on more.
Gotcha. No, and I'd agree. And actually, by hopefully having those conversations and those aspects of in training, that would hopefully mean for more fruitful, effective, and I think the term was effective mentoring relationships. And I know, so Tony's just sent me a direct message, which hopefully is come through now, and he sort of linked to the fact of agreeing that, there needs to be that a combination of formal and informal aspects of mentoring. Because as formal when it has to be, because we've got tick boxes, but actually that informal nature is where a lot of the fruitful stuff comes from. I'm cognizant of the fact that we are 10 minutes over our time. I posted into the chat the sort of summary questions that Dan, Andy, and Charlie posted in their chat, and I think this may be a nice place to finish on in terms of that, as us thinking about our own practice in terms of mentors and addressing those questions about, who is the mentee to me and who am I to them? What assumption do I have to have? Do we go through this as a mentor? Do we ask ourselves these critical questions each time we do this? And then if we don't, maybe this is the start of a journey to develop as mentors. But Andy, Charlie, and Dan, is there anything you wanted to sort of as a take-home message or question for the individuals within the chat, just to sort of post them to leave this session thinking, okay, I've taken this away. Maybe this is something I need to go look at or go read up on or go watch some YouTube videos about.
I think the principles that we're talking about are really crucial ones for anyone. We're talking about learning and development more generally, and we've located that within mentoring. I think if you're interested in that line of thinking and questioning, I think there's a wealth of knowledge and contradictory knowledge as well, that actually there's some really differences of opinion in terms of how things should be done. And I think my question or my comment or my objective from the back of this would be to go and engage with some of that, and actually perhaps if it does interest you, then go and make yourself feel a bit uncertain, because that in the process would then help make you, I think would make you a better educator and by default a better coach of as the process goes.
Awesome. And I think that's beautifully worded. Andy, Dan, do you want to add anything to finish before we say thank you very much for your time and sign off for this Sunday evening?
I'm all good. No, I'm all good. You?
Just wrestle with it. Enjoy engaging in practice. Maybe you're a mentee and you're asking yourselves these questions, and maybe you're a mentor, or likewise, maybe you're a coach. But I think there's real value in this across a number of different contexts. But thanks for your time, and some really interesting questions coming in. No,
and Dan, Charlie, and Andy, thank you very much for your time. It's always it's great to, I think you're the first guys to deliver like a chalk and talk session and have a good discussion around again a topic which is quite a challenging one, of which I know for being in the world of trampoline gymnastics for many moons, I've had the opportunity of mentoring a lot of people, and it's almost by hook or crook doing it and sort of working with individuals and doing it off intuition and working with others, but not having that support, potential training to go through it. So I think maybe this is a good starting point and a start for 10 for hopefully a shift in how we maybe do this moving forward. But on that bombshell, just like to say thank you very much, and a little clap to our presenters for the day. Thank you very much for your time. And I know it's a Sunday evening and you've given us an hour of your time, 1 hour and a bit of your time and more to develop this. But thank you very much. Some great take-home messages there. And team, I'll say thank you very much, and you may turn off. And this will be recorded, and we'll put it up onto YouTube if you want to watch it at a later date. But we'll say thank you very much. And as always, team, great to have so many people on a Sunday evening hoping to learn and learn a bit more about this complex process. But thank you very much all. Have a good rest of your Sunday evening.
Thanks all.
Au revoir.